Domestic. Domestic.
Ok, gente, então, desculpa os problemas técnicos, porque a gente tem que fazer uma transmissão ao vivo da palestra. Hoje é um prazer, então, ter aqui com a gente a professora Marion Pfeiffer, a Conferencias University, na Inglaterra, e ela é também professora, ela veio aqui com uma bolsa do nosso PPGEE, do PPGEE. Então, os alunos participaram, foi bastante certo, e hoje ela está aqui para fazer uma palestra para a gente, tá? Então, obviamente a palestra vai ser em inglês, se tiverem perguntas, questões, pode também fazer em português no final, tá? Não tem problema, a gente traduz. So, thank you very much, Marion, for being here with us, and it was really a pleasure to meet you and to have you here in our program. So you can go ahead with your talk.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And hello, everyone. I do not speak any only English. I can say 2 words, and the most important one I was told was valeu. So anything fair, just go out, valeu. And I hope that will work here. Let me just see. Yeah, okay. Do I have to sit down for that?
No, you can.
Yes, whatever. Yeah, I want to talk about the research I've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's all focused on restoration science. And I'm a classical ecologist, biodiversity scientist, if you want. And once I started actually focusing on restoration, I realized that you have to include people. So increasingly, I've been moving towards becoming that biodiversity scientist that works with the social scientists and that socio-ecological research. So hence the talk, Restoration for Biodiversity and People. I structured that talk to show you how did I arrive where I am today. So why this focus? Why do I do this research? I will talk about myself and my lab. So I'm the PI of the Tropical Landscapes Lab. Shortcut TROPS, I don't know. It's in German. In Germany, TROPS is a sweet. It's a very nice sweet, but it's written with a D, so I thought it's quite fitting. We are a very nice group, very diverse, lots of female PhD students. And the kind of research we are doing, I want to talk a little bit about that, so you see what we are up to. And then I will talk about restoration and restoration science and how I believe we have contributed to it, and also what kind of suggestions we are making on how to do that research better to bridge the implementation gap, to make restoration more successful. So talking about why we should restore, for many people that's quite clear, but actually when you start thinking about it, it becomes more complicated, and how should we do it? And then the last slide is just, where do I want to go from here, right? This classic standard, here I am, what do I want to do next? And why am I here, right? So just a quick rundown. So in 2002, that's when I did my MSc. So it was a long time ago, it's 20 years ago now. As I said, I'm a classical ecologist, right? I'm a rainforest scientist. I worked on rainforest, on spatial regeneration patterns of where are the adult trees, where are the young trees, what's the spatial patterns in there at quite small scale, and why does it matter for rainforest diversity? Very classic. And then because I had by then given birth to 2 children, I had to do some research in Europe, plant population ecology, still quite plants and populations, this kind of classic ecology. And they're looking at an orchid species in Europe and different populations. The species was moving northwards with climate change. And we wanted to understand mechanisms in terms of genetics, population demography, like how many fruits, how many seeds, why, how does it change with climate change, and so on. And then I went, the kids were getting a bit larger, so I could move again. I went to the UK, and what I really wanted to do was learning how to do GIS what I didn't realize that remote sensing is different to GIS. Remote sensing, working with satellite data, this is what they do at UCL. But I wanted them to just show me how to read maps. So by coincidence, I learned how to do satellite remote sensing and why it's really useful. For me, it's really like an eye-opener. Like I learned a lot from that state. Then I went back to Germany for a couple more years and then decided it is too cold. I can't work in Europe. I want to work in the tropics. And since 2009, I've been working in the tropics, mostly in Africa, Eastern Africa, to be precise. Started with a fellowship by Marie Curie, quite a prestigious fellowship in Europe, to work on structure of rainforests, structure of any woody vegetation that grows in Eastern Africa, and understanding how it varies in space with land use pressure and with climate. Then I went to Imperial College London because the fellowship had run out and I needed a job. And that's where I started to do landscape ecology, very cool stuff, habitat fragmentation and how biodiversity responds to habitat fragmentation. This is where I started the Biofra project, and that's important for the research I do today. And then I got my first permanent position as a lecturer in Newcastle, where I'm still today, now as an associate professor. And this is where I got the funding for a couple of projects that led directly to the work that I'm doing nowadays. I started with 2 PhD students, and now it's a little bit too many. It's 7 + 3, meaning 7 in Newcastle and 3 distributed around the world, co-supervising. And sometimes I get visiting scientists, and Julian, who invited me to give his talk, was one of those visiting scientists from Brazil. I'm the degree program director for the MRI Ecology. So if you have any questions on that, happy to answer those. And I'm also the co-director of it's an excellence center in Newcastle University for climate and environmental resilience. It's like about 55 academics across the university who work on these kind of topics. So I'm co-directing that whole center. And that, as I promised, I will pick 3 key questions that the PhD students and MRS students have been addressing in my lab. The first question was all related to roads and infrastructure. If you expand infrastructure, what does that mean for biodiversity? So is it the roads that's causing the problem or something associated with the roads? Because that's important, right? That will inform different management. Maybe I should put that down. Interventions, right? If it's not the road themselves, if it's just like the hunting that they cause or whatever, it's different mitigation. You can still have the roads, you just have to go in the forest, do the hunting, right? So what actually is the mechanism causing the biodiversity change is important to make a proper decision. Ideally, we can build roads in many rainforest landscapes because in our landscapes where we work, roads allow access to hospitals, schools, markets, if you want to sell your produce. So ideally, you can build roads. You just have to try to mitigate any negative impacts you might get for biodiversity or forest health. So that's the students that are working on this, mostly in Brunei Darussalam, but Laura, she has now finished, she is the doctor now. And she worked in Gabon as well and in Peru. And then the next question we are trying to answer is, where should we restore forests in the agricultural landscape? So you have converted forest is lost. How do we get some forest back in? Is that possible? And how should we do it to maximize? So we students only work with maximize biodiversity and carbon benefits. That's the main focus of their dissertations. It's 2 main projects. So Rebecca, she works in Sarawak. You know, lots of rainforest scan, huge, vast oil palm landscapes. And she's working with the oil palm company. The oil palm company wants to restore the forests. So she's working with them to say, this is where you should do it to maximize mammal biodiversity. So, and to maximize any seed dispersal functions that mammoths might have. So she's doing putting a lot of camera traps out in the landscapes and in the oil palm to see where the animals move through. Because that's no one actually knows how they move through the oil palm landscapes in this area. And then Chilene's doing a very similar approach, just working with birds instead of mammals and doing it in the Philippines. And she's currently doing her field work actually out there with these kind of tools. And the third, and again, that's important to us. We work with the farmers or the companies directly. So they have a buy-in and they're involved in the planning process, and they hope that this will actually encourage them to implement any evidence that we may find. And the last one is, can we predict how restoration of biodiversity? So if you restore maybe forests, maybe grasslands, how will this alter where the wildlife is? And how will it alter the interactions between people and wildlife? Think positive interactions, pollination, negative interactions, pests, and the damage on the crops. And we do that in Tanzania, and we started to do that in the UK. If you follow me on Twitter, you will have seen that very poor sad picture of where we planted some willow trees to create an agroforestry system in the UK, and they got really damaged. And we now put up camera traps to see who was the culprit. And we have hardcore evidence. We know now it was the bunnies. So what we already taking the little things off, unfortunately, yes. But there's still too much pressure. We have to hunt a lot more. I think that's what will happen. And then the other students, Eleanor and Bill, they go in Tanzania. And Bill is actually, he's an ecologist by training, but he is now doing just crop health research. So I think he feels very hard done by. Well, the only thing I can say is that he chose, he was able to choose whatever topic he wanted, and for whatever reason he wanted to work on the sugarcane and on the health of the sugarcane and on the yield of the sugarcane under different wildlife pressure. That's not my fault, really. And Eleanor is working really as a social scientist, so with the farmers in home gardens and going to their, so they often have home gardens where they plant crops, and then they have another farm somewhere else. And she wanted to know what trees they have on their farms and what they see as the benefits or opportunities from the trees and what the constraints are. And that will inform NGO and government planning, right? In terms of where do you plant such trees in these kind of landscapes. The tools we are using, it's very varied. It's people and nature interactions, so it has to be socioecology, a lot of social science tools, but also really hardcore science, remote sensing. As I said, I went to UCL, I know how to use these data. Spatial ecology and theory, resilience theory, for example, ecosystem resilience, looking for feedbacks, tipping points, things like that. In terms of, we do fieldwork, and I insisted my students do fieldwork because I want them to know what it looks like on the ground once they start taking data and modeling them. Because always they can't interpret these thoughts. I don't want them to make up stories. So a lot of different ones like camera trapping, binoculars, classic surveys, PPH measurement of trees and height of trees and identification and things like that. Remote sensing, so what we do is we link the field data to the satellite sensor data to map landscape attributes from crop health, vegetation health to forest biomass, anything like that goes. And then the participatory approaches, that's the social science, household surveys, focus groups, things like that. This is where we work. In green, the areas where we do most of our work. You can see it's focused on Borneo. And in Tanzania, East Africa. Oh. Date?
Olha, gente, vamos muito rápido. Finalizar o que eu falei. Finalizar no sentido de ela falar. Já tá pra gente, não vai conseguir mais.
Voltou. Tomaram boa.
Não viu, Leandro?
Não, não tem carga. O pessoal projetou.
Não, mas não perdeu uma vez.
Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it still recording?
De repente, coloca uma mensagem no YouTube, né? Só para dar uma mensagem.
Was that a power cut then?
The second grade. That's why we were having problems with the internet. Oh, but it's already.
That's hilarious.
Oh.
You can see the map. You can see that's my lab. So these two big dots, most of our world. And then yellow is really where we're starting to expand for reasons of, I find it very hard to give talks, generalizing results if I haven't actually worked in a lot of landscapes. So we basically have a lot of understanding from here, and we want to see how that looks like elsewhere. Hence the yellow dots. Lots of them in the tropics, like so, because fieldwork is too cold in the UK. And here we do have now a dot in the UK. We have started to work in, when I say we, people in my lab have done that. I really cannot stand doing fieldwork outside in cold environments. And the United Kingdom is very, very cold. And then we hope to add more points here. That's good. And then in Canada as well. And that will link to agroforestry and restoration research. Okay, let's just see whether that works. Do I have to? Yes. So even bigger, dark green. This is really the focus of the results that I will be showing in the next slide. So our current research. And it comes from these two projects funded by United Kingdom Research Councils. In the first instance, it's still ongoing, the last stages of the project. And then we got some additional funding later on. That was the classic bioscience, natural capital benefits to people and biodiversity. And then that one was almost a knowledge exchange impact component of the project. Funded through an international funder, anyone can apply for it. They fund a lot of different working groups, expert groups, Science for Nature and People Partnership, right? So if you have an idea, you can ask them for money. There was a lot more funding, but all small scale pots. So these big ones were big pots of money, and then a lot of added funding and partners being involved later on just to make things work out fine. And as you can see, there's a lot of people involved in that research. Okay, so context for it, I thought it's important. Why restoration science, right? Why do we do it? But both our research projects do is bottom-up, local scale, stakeholder-led restoration science. That's what we wanted to do, and that's what we want to promote, and we want to test, does it work? How do you do it? Why? Because when you think about the SDGs, I hope we all know what SDGs are, Sustainable Development Goals. Lots of them. I think it's 17 in total, highly intercorrelated. So what they basically say is you cannot have improved human well-being without healthier nature, and the other way around. Yeah. So they're very interrelated. If you want to have a positive outcomes for nature, you have to include people. You have to think about food security. You have to think about energy needs. You have to think about health and so on. We are hoping to do that to find solutions for the challenges that exist through nature. So nature-based solutions to global challenges when it comes to food security, climate change and climate change mitigation, and biodiversity. So that's several SDGs, several sustainable development targets. And forest landscape restoration is a classic one, right? To get there, it has quite big ambitions. It's not my invention. It's quite old now. It was led by people actually in America, I think. And what they focused on, at least in is to reverse ecological impacts of land degradation. So forests have been degraded for biodiversity and for human well-being. That's what the theory says. In practice, the people often fall a little bit to the side. So why they want to do it is because there is, as I just said, ecological outcomes and human well-being outcomes are intercorrelated. You cannot treat them separately. And you do restoration in landscapes. Typically, it's done in landscapes where a lot of people live, agricultural landscapes. So these people depend often on nature for their livelihoods, but they also just live there. So you need to work with them if you want to restore on the land, whatever that restoration might look like for grassland, for trees or whatnot. Oh, take that out. So global interest, obviously, in restoration of forest is absolutely massive. COP has just happened, right? We have this big new target, 30 by 30, that was this slogan. 30% of area to be restored by 2030 for biodiversity. That target number 3 in the CPD is actually much bigger. It says something about how to do it equitably for people, including indigenous community not being negatively impacted and all that. But in a sense, it means there's a lot of land to be restored. And then obviously you will have seen, or not obviously, but maybe you have seen Nature, Science, all the big papers on global restoration. Where should you do it to inform this target? They have been advocating for it, right? That's why, what's the science underlying that? And how, or where should you do it? Where should you focus? Where is it easiest to achieve that target? That's what all these papers have been doing. 2019, 2020 kind of time scales. And the reason why we're a little bit worried when I say we, I mean some ecologists and a lot of social scientists, is this one. A lot of the restoration here in yellow is restoration priority areas. And if you look at the maps, you see where they are. In the global south, as it's still often called, right? So in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and yes, in South America. It's in the tropics, so the top 15% of restoration priority areas. So this is where we should start according to the science. And then, so for 85% of restoration area land globally is in the tropics. A lot of them is where people are doing subsistence agriculture to support their livelihoods. And this is what's worrying about it, because what they basically say is this evidence underlying the 30 by 30 target is that many tropical countries would need to restore substantial proportions of their agricultural land to some kind of natural state. That's quite a big statement to make if you think that a lot of these agricultural activities are supporting food security and livelihood security of a lot of people. And then they did a quick calculation and missed a very quick analysis of what you're actually asking of countries to do to meet the target based on this priority area. So here you can see, for example, in the Philippines, they would have to restore almost 97% of their agricultural land. That's massive. And then it's quite annoying because the top countries that have to restore a lot of their cropland basically are like countries that are very poor. And a lot of the countries that are very rich, they have to restore any of their agricultural land based on this hard evidence. So down here is the United States, 1%. So we're not asking much of our money. And once we literally looked at that in more detail, we then, please do not tweet. Now it goes on YouTube. Sorry, Chris. I basically copied that out. He led that study. It's very important because he said, okay, this target 3 has been agreed now. It's out. We can do nothing about it. It has the potential to be transformative for the long-term future. It can provide a lot of benefits. However, you can read the wording online, right? It's published. How you get there to achieving this target is possible for multiple pathways. And depending on how you do it, you can have very different outcomes for biodiversity and for people. And associated costs and benefits, meaning like who is benefiting on a global scale and who is having the costs for giving up their agricultural land, having more human-wildlife conflict, and so on. And that's basically, there's a lot of counter evidence to the big hardcore evidence underlying 30 by 30, asking similar questions. Where are the people? What to do about the people? So this is where this fits in. We are saying, okay, yes, we want to include the people, but how do you do it? How do you get them in the models? How do you get them in the quantitative frameworks that ecologists are using to frame restoration science? And as you can see, for people and for wildlife, and we have developed a framework for that. This is a visualization by an artist on how that framework should look like. Maybe it works like it tries to sort of say there's different scales involved, right? For me, very individual scale, and the different factors that play out at the different spatial scales to affect the outcomes. That's all I will say for a very nice illustration. Because you're scientists, I'll give you a little bit more detail. So we had this framework, we proposed it to the funder. This is how it looked like before we started, right? This was our framework. We had, like, based on our knowledge on biodiversity responses to land use change, our hypothesis was that it matters where the natural habitat is, and it matters where the crops are. The distance to natural habitats is our key driver. And that can be changed by interventions, where you plant trees, whether you give government incentives to restore something, where the rivers are, and so on. It matters for how rich the people are, what their well-being looks like. It will affect whether they take away trees or not. This one will affect wildlife, and because it does so, it will affect species differently, pollination and pest control and pest damage, and that will affect crop yield and crop health. So that was our starting point. We had a lot of objectives, like, you always promise too much to the funder for the money you are given, which is always not very much. 9 hypotheses, which is massive if you think about it, and then 9 outcomes that you wanted. And this is what the framework looked like afterwards. As you can see, it looks a lot more detailed. Includes the social aspects, if you want to. In orange, there's a more classic biophysical aspects. And what that framework tries to display is what effects work to create 3 key outcomes. Ecological communities are biodiversity. The crop yield is food security. And the human well-being is, human well-being of, in this case, farmers. And you can get there through different pathways to these 3 outcomes, right? A central component being landscape configuration. And landscape configuration depends on a climate, topography, obviously, but also what interventions the government has in place, what decisions they have been making, what land management is like in terms of farmer decision-making, what they do on a very local scale, but also what, if you have an industry farmer, what they do on larger scales. And then you can see that all these other aspects of soil quality, microclimate regulation is affected by management and landscape configuration. We have metrics and indicators for each of these components. We can actually measure it, right? We can measure human well-being as well. And we can actually link the pathways. We can actually put numbers on them to see, is that an important pathway or not? That was the most important idea behind the framework, that it's quantifiable. But you can then use it to model all the way from here down here. And as you can see, landscape configuration is very central in there. It basically assumes that if you change that, you have a lot of follow-on effects on other things, including on biodiversity aspects, but also on crop yield and hence human well-being. And the external drivers and interventions, if you look it up in the paper, it is framed like this. It means anything from governance, who owns the land, who doesn't, to if you think about farmers, some rent it, some own it, different outcomes, on different management and decision making. And it could be things like restoration intervention. So you can actually play a scenario on that whole model, say I want to restore part of that landscape, and then model the pathways through and think about what does that mean for my outcomes if I did that planted. So science underlying this is hardcore for several of these pathways. So the first one is landscape configuration and wildlife. We know they are interlinked. You may have heard about edge effects on species. So habitat fragmentation, area gets smaller, but you get smaller habitat patches that are more isolated from each other, right? That's a classic. And then if you have a habitat patch, you have an edge, and that edge also affects species differently. I'm not making that up. We published that in Nature using a lot of data sets from all these landscapes around the world. And what we could see clear patterns. Some species like the forest, you will never find them outside. Some species like the matrix, you will never find them in the forest. Some species are generalists, some like the edge, a lot of variability, which you can analyze. And these species have different functions, right? Some are pollinators, some are pest control, some are pests. So that's the first one. And then, is there evidence for habitat structure changing with configuration and management? Yes, there is, like habitat edges, different structure. But can we also say something about that then? From habitat structure coming to microclimate, light availability, wind, temperature, right? It matters. If your crop is in a very open field, it's exposed to sunlight and temperature. If there's a tree above it, you will change microclimate. You will change shade. You have more humidity underneath it. And that's published as well. Like there's very clear linkages between how close the canopy is from trees and what the temperature looks like on the ground. You can measure that with thermal cameras, as we did. You can measure just the ground, or you can measure the leaf surface temperature. And what we see is a clear, like, for example, predictable decline in surface temperatures of your crops or any vegetation or your ground, your soil, with closing canopies, right? It gets colder in the forest. If you walk in there, you know that. You can actually measure it. And that's quite useful because then you can start predicting it. And then the last one is related to what does that mean for services and disservices? If you change the species abundance distribution in the entire landscape, like Becker, a former PhD student, did with lions, you can manage, you can predictively map conflict hotspots, in this case, livestock and lions. So this is one of those predictive maps. There is some, it's classic techniques for that. You're using machine learning if you want, or INLA, or just simpler models like LDA. And what that means is that if you change the landscape configuration, they're all linked to landscape configuration. If you change that, you will change the conflict in space. You will shift it around. And then all the other pathways in the big framework, they are literature-based. Right? We basically landed the literature, we looked at what are possible impacts, what does it look like, and how are they interlinked to different components. That's it. And that meant we also had to do a lot of data collection to test it in the landscape. That's what we did. That's our landscape in Tanzania, 30 kilometers, I think this way, and then about 30, I've heard you about that. All in green, forest. As you can see, there's a clear cut between the dark green areas and what's elsewhere. That's because these forests are protected. And then all that one is not protected, is a lot of cropland. Dense rural network, sugarcane industry farm here. Lots of smallholder farmers in the rest of the landscape. It's a key aspect of it. And you can see here some waterways going through the landscape, west to east. Because this is the mountains and this is where the water flows, and then it goes through the valley, and then it disappears, quite annoyingly so, because some people in the past thought it would be good to put some drainage things in there and stuff. And then you have a bigger river going all the way here, and then who's the Salu? Salu is a huge wilderness area, lots of animals, lots of elephants. This is how it looks like from, if you actually took pictures. So obviously we went everywhere. But we went to a lot of places. In the forest, you get a lot of, forest-dependent animals. In the valley, you get the sugarcane. And here you get, it's like from open woodland to forest, lowland forest variation. Lots of large wildlife, right? Lots of classic animals you would find in Tanzania, including these two and more of both species, elephants. They literally come from here, they cluster here, so you can't walk there in there anymore. It's too high, the population density of elephants, too dangerous. And then they spill out, they try to cross over there. And then they hit the people, and then obviously they can't cross easily, and they will go back into the forest. And then the rivers are highly degraded. The farmers farm to the edge. By law, they shouldn't, but they do because they need the land. Okay, and this is what we collected, all we stayed out. Microclimate, camera traps, bird surveys, vegetation, soil, insect plots. We basically hit it full force with everything we could possibly do over like a year and a bit, because it was a pandemic. So it was like, can you go? Can you not go? How do you go? But we got the data together in the end. And we did all the social stuff as well, including, do I have another slide? Later on, yes. Okay, let's talk about first, how did we measure, right? You can see a lot of people in the habitat fragmentation literature go only in the forest. We specifically did not want to do that. We wanted to know what they do in the cropland, because that's where we have some knowledge gaps. We don't know where does wildlife go, how does it use the landscape. So we did a lot of our measurements, as you can see, bird service and mammal service in the cropland and along the forest edge. I wanted to go in here, but then I proposed this to my colleagues in my research group, and they said, but why do you want to measure in the forest interior if you want to know the benefits to crops, Marion? And I was like, oh, that's annoying, it's right. So I wasn't allowed to go in here. It was a waste of resources, they said. So I only did the edge of the forest. Okay, and that's how we did measure. So there is a protocol now. If you haven't seen it yet, please look it up, how to measure human well-being, right? Lots of dimensions. In the course last week, we talked about it. You have like wealth is important, health, social status, freedom of choice, and security. These are the 5 dimensions. And there's indicators you can measure to calculate well-being along these 5 dimensions. So in Newcastle, while still at home, we designed some questions on well-being. How do we measure it in our landscape? What are these key indicators for our questions? And what is the people's perceptions of the value of nature? That's what we were interested in. Do they know about pest control? Are they aware of it? Do they know about tree benefits? Things like that. When we came to the site, and that was really important, we had to test it first, and then we had to change it because of the language that is used by local communities to express nature. What's nature, right? I mean, if you ask, any person may have a slightly different version of what is nature to them. And we had to make sure we got the answer we wanted. So we had to reframe our questions. Okay, some results. Now comes the proper biodiversity science stuff. I'm really sorry about the animation. I didn't quite work out. That's a mammal Venn diagram. What it shows is 4 habitat types, key habitat types in the landscape. The sugarcane estates, the small farms, the grasslands, and the forest. And what it shows is what species are only found in the habitat type itself, and what species are shared between different habitat types, right? So you can see for mammals, it looks like that. So for example, 10 species only found in the forest. Like 10 of those species never found outside the forest. But you can see 8 of them, 8 species are shared. They are used forest and the grassland. The 2 are on the grassland, the forest, and the smaller farm, and so on. So this is how you read the Venn diagram. And we did that to see what the mammals on the smallholder farms, are they just on the smallholder farms? Can it support them by itself? Or are they shared? Do they spill over, or whatever way they spill over, that's like cropland to forest or the other way around? Do they share habitat types? So for them, it was for us, it was quite useful to know that, because what we cannot do is say these 6 species, right, shared between these 4 habitat types. If we take one away, we wouldn't necessarily be able to say which one, what will happen, because we don't know. And this is how it looks like for the birds, and that's really important because you can see that the highest number is on the smallholder farms. So 44 species were only found on the smallholder farms. And the smallholder farms in our landscapes are very diverse. They're agroforestry. Like there's some crops, when the trees, it's highly heterogeneous, lots of habitat niches, lots of birds. So obviously now there, if that is true, if they are not shared, and we did loads of bird surveys points, right? 192 or something like that. What happens if you don't have some farms to raise 44 species? I don't know actually at the moment, you know, I wouldn't want to speculate. Yes, we had species that are only in the forest, enough, you know, these 38. So for them, it's quite clear if the forest goes, the species goes. And a lot of them are shared. So I had our research, just to make it simple, and I use these slides to talk with governance stakeholders and the industry partner in the research. So for them, it was useful to see it formulated as key messages. So what does that mean for me, for my operations? The first one was birds like the complex landscape. They like smallholder farm parts of the landscape. That was a key message from us to them. What that means is, if your argument is to close the forest off, and then if you do that, you need to intensify crop production. If you do that, crop land intensification, you're changing it from smaller farms to something else. And that will likely have negative impacts on the biodiversity in the landscape based on the data we have. So what you need to do if you are going to intensify, if you are expanding, is you need to have a retention of some semi-natural or natural habitat features. And then the question is, where do you do that? And in our case, we'll be promoting it along the riverways, just because they're a bit out of the way for them. They can still run their big machines across the fields and stuff like that. And then the second one was very important as well, because we didn't look just at total species richness. We split species into carnivores. Carnivores are important for pest control. If you think about sugarcane and the key pests being rodents, sugarcane rat, only on the sugarcane estate. Or if you think about insects, we need insect-eating birds mostly, but also mammals. So we split them. And then the results were quite clear. If you are intensifying and not having habitats for these pest control species, you may lose that pest control function, and actually your yield will decline because you don't have a pest control anymore. You will get these insect outbreaks. And a very key one in our landscape is aphids, sugarcane aphids. It's an invasive, so we believe the company brought it in. We have no evidence. It's basically an invasive species that's not so good for the crops. It spills over from the sugarcane to other crops as well. And then if you do that, obviously, like then you also have negative impacts on the smaller farmers. Key message 3 is very clear. From mammals, you need to have as much forest as possible. They seem to like the forest. There's more of them, more friendly mammals in the forest habitats. So any tree restoration would be good for them. And because it's good for them, and because some of them spill over, you will get more crop elephant conflicts if you have more of these bird tree covering the landscape. That's very clear. How did we model it? We use something called linear discriminant analysis as a key one for this paper we published recently. But you can model these pathways any way you want. The data are there, right? I tested GLMs. Some of them were good, some of them were not so well. We tested random forest models, try out what works. This is the approach we took. We did some model variable selection, which variable before running the LDA, which is a bit like a clustering algorithm using multiple predictors. And then you split your data set into training and test data sets. And okay, this is the quality of the model, something like here. And then you use it to predictively map something. The key predictors that we used were related to landscape configuration. As I said, it's central in our model, right? In our framework. And you can see here for different things, for different response metrics, different variables are important in that routine. So if I wanted to understand and map the presence, the probability of finding a threatened mammal species at a given point in the landscape, then I need to look for canopy closure, forest canopy closure. distance to road, and distance to forest. In green, if there's an increase with distance to, and in red there's a decrease. So distance to forest, the further you are away from forest, the less likely you are to find a threatened mammal species. That's how you read those. And what that means in terms of, oh, there should be a figure there, it's gone. And this is again, landscape configuration predicting crop damage from elephants. It worked really well. It was above 0.8, but like it's the quality of the model, and the 1 is the maximum, right? So 0.8 is a good cutoff point. We are fairly confident in these results. We had a that on where they recorded on the ground where the damage was on the crop, and we knew what crop type it was and what season it was. Didn't matter. What mattered was distance to this forest, as you can see, and we modeled and mapped it out. And we had a testing data set and a training data set, and the quality was really good. So we could predict where was the conflict very well. And you can see that the conflict is located primarily in the smallholder farms. Here's the sugarcane. This is because the road is over where the sugarcane is, right? They use it for their big lorries. Hardly any. Okay, but that will come later on, really important. And then the fourth message was tree canopies. They buffer from heat stress. There is clear evidence for that. This graph, it shows over the course, like we had microclimate sensors, right? And we put them out under different canopy closures just to see what happens during the course of the day. And as you can imagine, it's morning, goes towards lunchtime, sun is coming up, temperature goes up. It goes up really high. You can see here's 50. It can get really, really hot in the open land. That's canopy closure. And so it's different colors or different canopy closures. In red, these ones on the top, that's always like open land. There's no tree. And then in blue, it's almost closed. So you can see the massive temperature buffering effect from the trees. And for some crops, that's really important. And we did that for ground surface temperature, leaf surface temperature. We also looked at something called fluorescence of the leaves. If you don't know it, it's basically a little device. You put it on the leaf, and then it gives you a measurement of how much chlorophyll is in the leaf. And then you can say something about its photosynthetic capabilities. Yeah. This is fluorescence, and you can see that the increase in canopy closure, you get more productivity of ground vegetation. They measure this on the ground, on the leaves. With increased canopy closure, you get a decline in surface temperature. It gets colder in the forest. And then we thought, like, there surely has to be an effect, a positive effect on crop. Did not find any effect. We didn't find a negative effect, which is very important, because often farmers are like, if you have a tree, it's bad for my crop, I get lower yield. Didn't find that. But we also didn't see a positive effect, at least not from the few data points that we had. What happens is actually, we had a lot of farmers. And then we said to the farmer, once you harvest, please call us so we can measure the yield. Sometimes we were just in time and saying, what are you doing? I'm harvesting. So we went, we had only a couple of plots. These are the plots. And for sugarcane, actually sugarcane, likes it open. Sugarcane can get so hot, more than 50 degrees during the day, doesn't care. It's like happy, very annoying. Was the purpose of the study. Okay, and then another message, because I said we measured people's well-being along with dimensions, and we also asked them question on, do you perceive nature as good or bad, or what's the value from nature that you get? And we analyzed it because it's an ordinal scale, right? It's not continuous, so we used an ordinal regression model. And what's the key findings between gender, male, female, and whether they had experienced crop damage or not. And we were thinking, like, if they have more crop damage, that they might really not like nature, that they have a less positive perception of nature's values. However, what the data clearly showed, with increasing well-being of farmers along the 5 dimensions, you get a higher perception of nature's value. And it didn't matter whether they had experienced crop damage or not, which is because what it means is that they would, even if they experience crop damage, at least in the current situation, they would still perceive nature as positive if they're well, and that would suggest that they are positive towards you proposing to restore some nature. So what does that all mean then, right? All these data are whole very good things. What does it mean for the restoration of nature, for people and biodiversity? And this is where this one comes in. A just and effective approach to restoration begins by working with the people who live and make a living from the land. That's our starting ground, right? This is what we are not touching on. This is like our core approach. When we came to the landscape to say to the farmer, oh, we are interested in natural capital and nature benefits to you guys, they said to us, no scientist that has been working in the landscape, and they have been working there for more than 20 years, people going in the forest and stuff, right, measuring mammals and birds, has ever come back and told us what they found. None. No one. And then we spoke to some of the scientists and they said, oh, I've never actually asked farmers anything or talked to them. It's like, 20 years, come on. So it's really important to get them on board if you want to achieve in the landscape, obviously. And restoration by its very meaning means you're going on their land. So we really now focusing on that implementation gap. So all that hardcore evidence, it's good for the mammals. You can imagine it's good for some birds, depending on how the cropland is managed. But how do you implement that, right? How do you bridge that implementation gap? So a couple of approaches we used. I mean, it's not exhaustive. It worked very well for us. So the first one was we actually went, well, as I said in the course last week, I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a social person. I hate talking to strangers. I send people out to do that. These people. Very nice people. This is my PhD student in the lab, and she worked with 2 local scientists, social scientists from Tanzania. They obviously speaks the language. Lily actually comes from the landscape, so she has the trust of the community, so that works really well. And then Margarita is a postdoc that worked at the University of Leeds, and she's a trained social scientist, so she knows all the frameworks we scientists use, which are very complicated philosophical frameworks. Okay, and what we did is they went into the landscape and then started off with just ask farmers, what does the ideal future farm look like, right? What do you want? What is your farm currently looking like? Where do you want to go in the future? Didn't mention trees. We didn't mention natural capital whatsoever. Just that. And then you ask them to draw it, like 2 drawings of that, and then discuss it. Why do you draw this? Why do you want this? And then to recorded these conversations about their farms. This is where they did it, right? In different locations in the landscape. Because remember the crop conflict map? They might have very different views on how they see their future farms in relationship to those people. These villages here, they sit on the main road. It's a big road, easy transport to markets. And we had lots of participants, like we wanted to get a good sample size. And then we had these kind of drawings. And the good news is trees featured on almost all of their drawings, just because they wanted trees anyway. But they want them only in certain locations, not scattered across the farm, but like farm boundaries delineation, around the river, around the pond, around my house. Things like that. They also wanted other things. They wanted to own their farms. Super important to them. They want to expand the amount of the land they cultivate, which is not so great news. Diversify their agricultural activities and increase their access to water. So they had a lot of things that they really wanted, which are important for their well-being. And This diversification, so we are very well aware of climate change impacts where it's gotten drier in the dry season and there's more water coming from the mountains, floods in the rainy season. And the floods typically, they drown the village, literally, like there was lots of water, standing water, and they also take soil away from along like erosion along the rivers and along the creeks that are in the landscape. As part of your adaptation, climate change adaptation strategy, I think about diversification of what they grow. And trees were mentioned, fruit trees, trees for firewood, and trees for medicine, things like that. And this is a very controversial, because obviously a lot of NGOs also give them fruit trees to plant, mangoes, citrus fruits, and so on. However, the elephants also like fruit trees. I do. So farmers know if I have a lot of fruit trees, I will attract more elephants, I will get more damage. And it's up to them to decide what the relative benefits and costs are of that approach. There is a couple of trees that they mention more often than others, so this is very useful for us, because we know now, okay, these are the trees they want. This is what it means for biodiversity, soil fertility, if they were to plant these trees, and for conflict, and then can give that evidence to the farmers, and then this is what will happen, or is likely going to happen, and then they can make their decisions. So perceived benefits relate to income, also cultural. I had trees when I was growing up. I want my kid to have trees and so on. And then there's challenges that they associate with tree restoration. It's always related to costs and so on. If you know the challenges, you can mitigate for them, right? You can provide the seedlings for free. You can help with how to grow a tree. We can think about where the fire come from. They come from the sugarcane, how to spilling over from the sugarcane. The sugarcane estate uses fire for harvest. Lots of environmental pollution, lots of air pollution, and spillover. And they do it. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's for ease of use and for the snakes. Some very toxic snakes in their state. And then water, always a key role. So your main argument, if you wanted to achieve any behavior change, it has to be related to water quality and access to water in this landscape. So the key message from all that social stuff is that tree restoration may be perceived as beneficial, but it requires support in terms of how to deal with challenges related to tree planting. And we know this now. So the next step would be like, just start doing it in that way. We obviously didn't stop as the farmers. A lot of stakeholders, academics, farmers, and the government, of course, as well. The government has a stake in the industrial plantation, so an economic interest in sugarcane production. The government also has different sectors: biodiversity, agriculture, energy, and so on. So they have a viewpoint, which is displayed here. Very quite commonly used language, right? We need to encourage farmers to adopt the new strategies. They didn't even know they already did agroforestry, apparently, It's like a misalignment, perhaps, in understanding where ethicide comes from. They also had very certain ideas of where to restore trees, and it looked slightly different to what the farmers wanted. So government sees it more parcel, big areas of land crop production, big areas of land for the trees, and so on. Then there's NGOs, and they all also have their own views. They have their own funding. They are tree restoration focused NGOs. And they have needs from the funder to prove how they spend their funding. So they have time pressures related to their targets. So what they have already started to do is plant trees without actually understanding fully how they should restore these trees in the landscape. Okay. I haven't lost you yet, right? All there? Good. So remember, I mapped the elephant conflict based on my model and the data, right? From where the conflict was in the landscape configuration. So what I can do next is change landscape configuration. I can tell my model that looks different now as a map because I restored some trees in theory, right? I simulate, I do a scenario of what happens if I restore trees along all the rivers? I put more trees in the landscape. What will happen to my outcomes? Right, these model and the maps of where the forest is. What I can then do is I can predictively map, without having actually planted anything yet, how the landscape would look like in terms of probability of finding threatened mammals, probability of finding lots of birds, probability of conflict. This one shows a change in conflict with elephants if you restored trees along the rivers. And then the increase in conflict is shown in pink. And you can see it will increase along the riverways, so the elephants may like to move under the tree cover, and then occasionally they go out to eat. So if you did that, you will get new locations of conflict, an increase in conflict in a lot of the smaller farms based on the models. And you can do that for any as long as your LDA model is a good model or your random forest model, you can predictively map the impact of restoration interventions on most things. And then you can take the maps and you can go to the NGO or the farmer and say, this is what will happen or is likely going to happen. Does that change how you view that intervention? Would you do it differently? Or what mitigation would you now use to prevent that from happening? This is really important because if people get conflict over a longer time scales, they start adapting to it. They start living with it, or at least they do in our landscape, right? That's what the data suggested. If you displace conflict to new locations, what this means is you might get conflict in places where people never had conflict before, and they might have certain views on that, right? So that you don't want, at least they should know this is going to come their way, so they can make their own decisions on whether they like it or not. But you certainly have to think about what you should do in terms of mitigation if you didn't want that to happen. And when we did that in our trial scenario of restoration, this is what you can see here, just some key outputs. What's the probability of finding a high number of bird species? In gray points, or is the baseline before the intervention, for the theoretical modeled intervention, and in orange after. So if it moves in this direction, it's a decline. If it moves in this direction, it's an increase. You can see for birds, you don't actually get benefits from the restoration, often no change. But on grassland, you would maybe see a slight decline. This is what it looks like for mammals. The probability of seeing lots of mammals, or importantly, the probability of observing at a given location in the landscape a threatened mammal. How does it change when you plant trees? And you can see it increases quite a bit. So for mammals, good. For birds, not so. Based on the model. That is acknowledging, obviously, there's model uncertainty, right? You would need to calibrate and validate, at least in some sites, whether that is a true thing or not. The model might be wrong, right? Okay, and you can use the same for conflict. And you can see here, how is crop conflict going to change for the smaller farms, industry farms, in the crop plants, and you can in general, it goes up, go up, if you plant these trees along the rivers. Yeah. That's how an elephant looks like there. It's a very big animal. And I mean really big. I've seen one close in the car, in the forest, and we were like, you know, oh, elephant, really close. Go closer than they did. And then the elephant went a bit mad at us. And I can tell you, it's the most frightening experience that you can ever experience. All we said is scream to the driver to drive. And he panicked, and then he drove, and the elephant was running afterwards. It's not an experience you want. Now imagine a farmer on that farm with an elephant in the backyard. Yeah, he cannot drive off. And the elephants, they come under the trees, and then they come out in the farm. He doesn't often know the elephant is coming. And we had in the last years, because of an increased number of elephants coming from the salute, 2 people being killed. In 2 years. That's, in my opinion, too much. That's 2 people too much, right? And it's going to get worse. Yes, I put a forward in there. because it's really important to me, right? Like that people acknowledge the threat that is coming from if you increase restoration in a given landscape, and the threat is coming from large animals, and it's coming not to you as a foreigner in your car coming to the country saying plant more trees. It's coming to the people living there, making a living from the land. And this is the next two key messages, right? First, there is this lack of alignment between what the government wants, what international NGOs want, and what farmers need. And we need to increase communication. And the second one is this one, that these predicted maps that we created in the project, they are not what should guide your activities. You can take them and you can go back to your stakeholders and negotiate what it might mean for them. And it's up to them to make decisions on what they are willing to compromise on, because there has to be compromise, right? If you have these costs from more conflict, someone has to live with these costs, and they have to make the decisions on those. And just in terms of, because I get confused very easily when it comes to terms like that. This is the reality, right? There's a guy down there. See this as a marginalized community in the landscape. That's what equality means. That's what equity means. They're having a lower starting point. You have to give them more of a push-up. And then liberation would obviously take the fence away, but you're a long way off from that one. Okay. What does that mean for restoration, right? In our landscape is like that there is now a framework. We can look for outcomes related to people, human well-being, biodiversity, climate change mitigation, forests, climate change mitigation, yes. Adaptation, do we plant different crops? We can measure that, and now we can use it to monitor. So if we actually had an intervention, you should actually monitor measuring indicators for each of these pathways that I've shown in the big framework over time, to see what's happening and to adjust whatever you do if you wanted to change the outcomes. And let's see, tree planting outcomes for biodiversity. Remember the birds? Remember the mammals? Yeah. But biodiversity will differ depending on where the trees are planted and in what configuration. The outcomes for people will also matter depending on where the trees are planted and in what species. And you need to use that. You need to use a very complex approach to understand what outcomes are produced to benefit from decision making. So yes, restoration interventions have the potential to benefit people, but they also have the potential to harm people. And that you need to account for that to include an equity approach in your conservation. And remember, target 3, it has a component of equitable management. If you want to do that right, it will take you a lot of time to get this right. We have been working in the landscape since 2019 on these questions. And we are by no way, there's no way we are near the proper answer yet, right? It has been a lot of work, a lot of money involved, and a lot of people employed to get the data that we have at the moment and the understanding. And you can imagine that's just one little tiny landscape. And there is a couple of papers that have been involved in, certainly not leading because I'm not a social scientist. So my understanding of equity is very limited. It's just the basics what I know. And they have proposed some of the ways you could approach restoration or conservation interventions and what you should look out for. I won't read it out. Have a look at the papers that have been coming out recently. And then just to show where, okay, that's an old talk. I'll try to remember what other steps I had. So the first one was systems approach framework. You have seen them as a framework, right? Tested it on one landscape. I want to test it on other landscapes to see, does it work there as well? What other things to look out for? Do I need to add pathways depending on whether livestock is present or not and other things? And the second and third was where to do that. So that's why I'm visiting Julian as well to discuss whether we could. So I have collaborators in Canada in Germany and also in Southeast Asia, but it would be nice to get a couple more landscape inputs still looking at implementing the systems approach framework and see how well it could work. And then build a database around that. And then the second and third steps are probably related to how to make sure that restoration moves away from global biophysically science-focused mapping exercises to something that can actually produce equitable solutions for effective restoration, and meaning effective on the long term. If people are not on board, you will not. You might plant some trees, but they will not survive in the long run. It's not going to happen. Like, we have plenty of evidence that if the people are not on board, government or farmers, your forest will not survive that you planted. It's not going to happen. Okay, with that, I've finished. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you very much, Mary, for your talk. It was really interesting. Algumas perguntas?
I don't want to just gonna your opinion about the passive restoration.
Yep. Good opinions, but you need land. So if you have, assume you have the land, ideally you want passive restoration because it's cheaper. And I do believe that if there is a forest left in a landscape where that can facilitate that passive restoration, it will probably work quite well. So Chilean in the Philippines, she is specifically looking at how birds are moving, where they put their little seeds on the droppings. Method depends on whether you have some single starting trees and how this would then facilitate natural restoration. So you don't actually have to plant trees because that's very expensive. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all the great. I was very worried about the conservation priority error snap for the world because it shows that some countries have to conserve to restore large areas.
Yeah.
And they already have so much commitments and their social, their well-being. And I'm wondering, another data that exists is the one for emissions of greenhouse gases, and this can go for per capita and for historic emissions. And it's interesting because in that map, the figure that appears is the cumulative per capita emissions for the greenhouse gases. The figure that appears is another. So there is a priority for restoring ecosystems. There is also a history of emissions and of environmental costs that we have over our history. And I'm just thinking, because it's very important that there are research labs as yours that are thinking about the fairness and the justice and the equal access to data. And of course, in development as Brazil and others, sure there is a need for also increase in the efficiency of agriculture. That sure can happen. That sure it's possible. It has been happening for some years. Like the production yield has increased very much. Not so much of increase in the agricultural land. So it's possible. There's lots of investments. So the question is about how do you think that this context can be managed? And do you think that research as yours, that with investments in new data from context in development are important in this context, also for other countries to start to developing their autonomy and to making decisions that are also in the interests of their development.
I try to answer some of that question because of it's a big question. So the first one was, as you mentioned, the historical context in which landscapes are situated. So like, who has done the emissions in the past? What was in the landscape before? What is there now? I am not aware of global mapping exercises that have done merit. We know that in our landscapes, historical context is super important. We ask questions on merit. So actually, we have forests in some areas, and the sugarcane industry has taken out a lot of that. So how I always see it in my head is like, yes, the national park is now fenced off, so the people can't go into there to get their forestry. They have put up a new protected area down here, so people can't go in there anymore. And in the past, the sugarcane has taken up land and has taken the forest away. So the smaller farmers are getting increasingly squeezed. There's a shortage of land, which is not necessarily their own fault alone, right? So this is a problem, but it's very difficult to put numbers on it. It could be in our framework, it would fit under the governance decisions, the blue pathway, and it certainly we try to account for it to some extent. The second, that was on intensifying crop yield without expanding the area. There's two challenges with that. The first one is climate change. So if cropland intensification, often in what I've seen is it means a monocrop still, and then what that means is like if it gets too hot for that monocrop, maybe not sugarcane, but sugarcane is not necessarily something you can eat a lot, and nor is it very healthy. So what you will get is a risk, a food security risk from cropland intensification through just that monoculture. So you want to diversify to prepare for that as a climate change adaptation strategy. That's that diversification. So the green revolution, when they say we produce more yield, it actually, when you look at it, especially in America, there was a recent study out there that clearly showed that because of the way they have intensified the crop production on maize, I think it was, the soil fertility has declined. So actually your yields are going down now. So something has to give you. If you keep using it, you'll have to repay it at some point. So I believe that agroforestry is the best way forward for many landscapes. So you have to just make sure, or you have to try to see that you can maximize the benefits for biodiversity in the way you put the trees on the farmed land. That's how I think it will happen. Yeah. Does it answer your question?
Yes. It's very important to restore some ecosystems.
Yeah.
But there are also lifestyle changes that must be made.
Yeah.
And there are concessions and commitments that must be made in a global scale, because there's so much of history, right? And it's interesting to think what sorts of contributions can come from all sides.
Absolutely agree. And there's lots of discussions, like look out for them, join some groups, social scientists and political ecologists, they can go wild on that. You know, you can spend days with them just discussing it. It's very interesting. But you have to come to some practical solutions, and it ideally something that you can check, does it work? So if you want to check whether something works, you need to be able to measure and monitor. And this is quite difficult when it comes to well-being, for example, or economy. You need to collect the right data. It requires time and money, which a lot of people in conservation do not have. I think that's fair to say, right? You're the most underfunded discipline, I believe, that there is, apart from the arts.
Onde trabalhos relacionados a essa temática, você tem muito
Not yet. We have been discussing some with Julian and Mayel from one of the institutes, the Agriculture Institute. We hope to run it. So there's a couple of calls out now, like funding calls, and we want to. One of the ideas is to test the same what we did in Tanzania, in Brazil. In what was the location? So location where we wanted to focus on first.
Also includes the farmer. Just the reserve. Yeah.
Yeah. What are your expectations about this type of landscape in Brazil? Do you think it's going to be similar to Africa or
you will have smaller. I'm sure there's pests. I'm sure there's disservices. I think the main differences will come from the governance context, in terms of how people make decisions and what decisions they take within the big national laws that are in place, and how people historically would have responded to these laws. As I said, in our landscape, laws exist on certain things and people don't follow them. They don't trust the government. I have no idea how it looks like in Brazil yet. I'm sure we'll find out. But yes, it will mostly be related to social factors rather than the ecological ones.
I was wondering, we actually often discuss about this. How do you incorporate aquatic ecosystems into this restoration project?
I know. Understudied. Don't get me wrong. I certainly never looked at freshwater in my own research because it's difficult. It flows. Not only does it flow, the annoying thing is it actually takes input from the surrounding landscape at different points in the landscape. So you would have to do a lot of measurements. But we do have a freshwater scientist that focuses on invasive species now on the team. It's not enough. There needs to be more fish people who look at this and things like that. And people who actually do riparian buffer restoration, because it's not easy, as I understand, what plants to grow along the river so the soil doesn't get washed out or get destabilized. So it can be incorporated, but it's certainly not properly included yet. What I do know is that you have a canopy closure. If you don't have trees over your river, you will get a very hot river under future climate change in many landscapes. And hot water will change what fish or what aquatic organisms you will find in the river, and that will change your processes. But I haven't measured it myself yet. I know that in theory how it should work, but in practice, different question.
Yeah, that's something. It's really was. I mean, it is super relevant, super important because but it's kind of a little bit like disappointing for us to see that rivers are never included in these projects. I mean, rivers, water. we need water, right? It's and it's so relevant in terms of also for the temperature. I mean, especially because most of the water is in low order streams, which have a very high heavy over. So I mean, if you cut those trees down, if you don't have forest anymore there, that's the impact is really, really big.
Yeah.
And it is true, it's really difficult to incorporate fresh waters because they flow. Exactly. And we have actually work with this kind of this impact that is natural but also longitudinal, right? So everything that happens upstream reverberates downstream, right?
Yeah.
That's for sure. But I was very curious of something, maybe I didn't understand very well, but were you saying that if trees are planted on the riparian areas of those rivers that you were showing in Tanzania, elephant would make more damages because they would walk in and then go out.
So at the moment you have the forest triangle, so they're coming through that forest from the Siluri, they're trying to cross. That's where a lot of conflict happens, and then they go back in because they can't cross easily. If you restore these linear structures, reverse coastal landscape, what you're doing is you're facilitating their movement under protection. If they move, so data suggests that they will not stay in the corridor, as it is called a corridor, right? Wildlife restoration corridor. They will move out to eat, and they will do that. So data suggest quite randomly. I know that fruit trees attract them. So if you have fruit trees on your farm, I would still think you're more likely to get, but the data don't suggest that yet. The data suggests it's random. They go out and then find something and then feed and go back. So that's why we believe that the likelihood of more conflict and conflict in new locations will happen if you restore trees. Unless, so the NGO that is advocating for this restoration is promoting to put fences around the corridor, which is a very interesting debate to be had, because if you have a linear structure going from west to east across a highly populated countryside, right? People living north, people living south of the fence, what you are asking them to do is, if their farm is here and their house is here, to get across. And then we asked, how do they get across? And it's not just one, there would be loads of people, traveling between villages. They don't have cars. Lots of them don't have cars. They might have a picky, like a motorbike, and the roads are really bad. So what it might take a 10 minutes walk, 2 hours drive, if they can afford a picky. This is what you're asking them to do. And then they said, okay, and then they came back and then they said, we put crossing structures, like a barrier that they can open. And then I said, well, then you have the elephants. Is there a ranger looking out for the elephants? So what if the a kid going from school to village and other way around? How would that work? Like, who's patrolling it to tell the people it's safe to cross? Oh, and then they haven't found a solution yet. They believe there will be rangers, maybe. And then I said, well, who's paying for it? So there's a lot of question that will happen once you start coming up with solutions, like I just put a big fat fence around that, right? It's not as easy as and straightforward as that. Like they could do these viewing bridges, like, have like you go over the motorway. A bridge, that might be a nice one, right? You can combine it with ecotourism. And then someone else said, well, if you do that, what will happen is you will get more illegal poaching, because they can just use it to look for the elephants and then take them. So yeah, what can I say? It's tricky.
Yeah, very much. No, it was really sad actually to hear this about because that's for rivers is the first thing that we should do, like just restore like at least buffer of the vegetation.
You still have to do that.
Vegetation, right? That like creates more conflict. It's very complicated.
We talked to some government officials and they said what they successfully used in another landscape further northeast is they worked with people to spot an elephant, to look out for when this animal comes, and how to deal with it. So if an elephant comes, what do you do, right? I would scream and run. So they propose different things that you should do so that the elephant actually moves away from you. Can't quite recall what it was, and I don't want to promote wrong strategies in case you're coming to that situation and then die, and then you blame me. But there is strategies you can teach that people have used successfully somewhere else. Yeah, if you know that this is will be a problem. Sorry.
Just to mention that about forestry.
Yeah.
In the drawings that people have made, from what I understood, they separate the farmland from the tree, for the forest. It figured that they must have some use for the forest, certain sustainable ones. In some context, they must also use resources from the forest, recognize the balance. But I didn't see it explicitly put. But in Brazil, there's lots of considerations of the Amazon forest, the importance of it as a forest, and of the even of the historical use of indigenous people that must have developed that forest in forest that they have for centuries enjoyed with the selective that they thought were most interesting there. So here, agroforestry is very important as an idea and concept to keep trees up and even to restore them. It's not like there's no use for them. And what you see in this context of potentialities for the forests.
It's one of the is cultural knowledge and use of tree species. So national park in the past, if you go in there, they will explain this to you. It was used by forest dwelling communities, people who live in the forest. Because it's a national park in Tanzania, they have disappeared. So there's this historical context, they have been excluded from the forest. But they definitely use the trees for different malaria treatment to anything else, right? Some of these trees are still grown in the landscape in the valley, a lot of them not. So there is potential for restoring them. There might have been cultural knowledge already being lost. We don't know that, like, you know, who has retained that knowledge, who's using it in what village. Published. And this NGO that is focusing on restoring trees, they have looked at different tree species. What are their uses by people, and what and then what are other benefits, like for soil or fertilization or things like that, because there's different things people might want from the trees. Absolutely. But it's a tricky one. The forest dwelling communities are not in there, and they're not allowed to be in the boundaries of the national park, and you cannot go in and take things out. Unfortunately, that's just the strategy by governance, what the country chose to do. Yes.
That's much of the importance for the speakers who might be in the forest themselves.
Certainly in the past, yes. But I'm not sure, like it's tricky, like, you know, I'm not Tanzanian. I wouldn't want to tell the government of Tanzania what's right and wrong. They would have been told by someone in the past that's an important area of forest for biodiversity, so you would have to protect it. And someone would have pushed for this to be a national park, and elect people. Who that someone was, I wouldn't want to speculate. You would have to look that up yourself. Because, you know, it's a contentious topic. Yes. We have a lot of WWF and IUCN operations in the country, historical in a lot of areas. And more recently, if you go on Twitter and Google it, there would have been evictions by the government from certain areas. Maasai pastoralists, they had a hard time, right? Not allowed to be here, not allowed to be here. Where do they go? You're pushing these people somewhere new, and then because they haven't interacted with this landscape before, there will be changes to the landscape, and then you upset the locals that have always been there, and there's lots of tensions now between different groups of people at different levels of hierarchy, and it's a complex situation. Yes.
Thank you very much. Really interesting.
Good. Any questions afterwards, you can just write me an email. So happy to share the slides, given that the recording didn't work. Sorry. Thank you for coming. How was it?
Great.
Very cool. So we decided to do something with streams and rivers here in Brazil. Just like
I already thought about some things if it's going to happen, that project. I think that's we could easily include river and water quality and ecosystem services, because this is also related with ecosystem well-being and people well-being. Because you could have